I'm Curator of Education Anna Smith, and today I'm happy to introduce artist Kathryn Andrews. Kathryn Andrews' work thrives on and generates startling juxtapositions. Employing materials that range from ephemeral party balloons to movie props to borrowed works by well-known artists, her visual contradictions challenge viewers' preconceived ideas about the value of disposable, pleasurable objects and of so-called high art. Examining issues of authorship, permanence, and the role of the viewer in static, immutable works, Andrews fuses serious art-historical dialogue with a keen sense of humor. Kathryn Andrews received her BFA from Duke University and her MFA from Art Center College of Design. Her work has recently been seen at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania, at United Artists Limited in Marfa, at the Rubel Collection in Miami, and at MoCA Los Angeles. In 2012, Andrews will present a solo exhibition at David Kordansky Gallery in Los Angeles. Kathryn has asked me to advise you that there will be some graphic images in the presentation, so please use your discretion as you're viewing this. And now, we are very pleased to be hosting her today. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Andrews.
So I thought I would start by, instead of talking about my work in the way that I normally do, which is to give a historical overview in terms of earlier works, my thinking around them, and then sort of how my thinking developed. Instead, to do something much more mixed up, sort of a hodgepodge, and let's see where we can go with that. So hopefully you can bear with me. I'll try to make it make some kind of sense. I wanted to start by asking a question, which is a question that, I'm not even using this thing. Is it coming from here? Oh yeah, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. I wanted to start with a question which is one that I think about a lot, and it's a question that drives most of what I'm making. And that question would be, where is the work? I'm interested in thinking about how we locate the artwork when we see it. How we language it, how we describe it, how we define it. And in relation to that, I would ask a second question, which is, where is the artist? And I think that these two questions are very closely linked, and perhaps one can't be answered without answering the other one. So I wanted to start with an image that is a screen grab from Art Basel's website. I was invited to be on a panel discussion there in June in Switzerland. They host a lot of talks between artists, curators, whatnot, in relation to works being shown at the fair. And if you look here, it's probably hard for you guys to read it, so I'll tell you what you're looking at. This is from Art Basel's website, and then talks and events, and it goes on to show like, oh, this talk happened with these people, and if you click on the website, there's a little button you can press, and you can see the talk online. So one day I was like, well, I wonder if my talk is up there. Oh God, I hope not, I'm so embarrassed. But anyway, there's more details about that. I'd had a wild night the night before. So I looked online, and to my relief, here is this video that's posted here, and it says the panelists were Abraham Cruz Viejas, who's from Mexico City. He was on my right. Myself, artist from Los Angeles, and the moderator, Jens Hoffman, who's a curator at CCA Juarez in San Francisco. And then I look up, and above is a video about Cy Twombly. So if you press this button on the website, for an hour you can hear a very interesting discussion about Cy Twombly. And I thought, oh, well, that's fascinating. What happens in this kind of situation? Will anyone actually watch these talks? Probably not, because we all have a lot to do. But for those people really bored who want to, I wondered what kind of sense they're going to make out of like this kind of information and then this kind of information. And so a lot of times this sort of thing seems to happen to me, but I don't think I'm alone in that. I think it's just a lot of people transmitting information around. Mistakes happen, so probably the person who set up the site incorrectly linked to this video. So I thought, well, what happens in that case? Do I contact them and ask them to correctly link it? Does my gallery do that? Does some random person watching this in Art Basel a note? So I haven't done anything about it, and we'll see what happens. So I'm curious to see how that develops. these are the kinds of things I'm interested in thinking about. What happens when an artwork exists, it gets attached to an artist's name, and when that artist's name gets sort of bandied about in the systems that are out there, creating slippages between the representation, slippages between the work and the way that that work gets represented. Let's say that. So to go more specifically into my work, let me start by showing you an image from 2007. For a while, I was making works that had a lot to do with some of the formal questions explored by Russian constructivism. And that was through 2002 to 2007. And as I was making those pieces, people were coming to them and saying, oh, it reminds me so much of early modernism. And I said, great, I love early modernism. And they said, yeah, great, and they would walk away, and we wouldn't talk about it further. And what I realized, what kept happening, was that works I was making in that time, people were easily placing them into a visual category that felt very familiar to their knowledge of art history. And so if it seemed quite familiar to them, instead of really looking at it and thinking about how it might be different than what they'd seen before, they would pretty much just say, oh, I sort of already know that, I'm busy, I got a lot of other stuff to look at, and they walk away. So I thought, well, that's kind of a bummer, because I'd rather people have a more engaged interaction with my work. So what I decided was that I wasn't going to make work like that, that I would do something different that would require people to have a different kind of response. So it took me quite some time to figure out what that was. In 2007, I made this piece. This is an artwork here. I curated a show in Los Angeles with a bunch of young LA artists called Modern Lovers. And the show had a component where I interviewed the different artists, and I was trying to understand how they made sense of their own relationship to modernism, or to a sort of historic vernacular. And if they thought that was okay, or was that weird, what kinds of responses they were getting when people were looking at their works. So this is actually an artwork by an artist who lives in Los Angeles named Jill Spector. And as I hung this show, I decided as I was going along that the show was lacking in some ways visually. So I decided to just insert some decorative elements that appeared to be artworks, or maybe they were artworks, that would help the show have a more sort of powerful, formal appearance. So this is one of those things that I inserted, and I decided that with these works that I wouldn't give them titles and I wouldn't put my name to them. So as you walked around the exhibition, you would come to 3 objects within it in addition to the works in the show, but there was no information about them. And I thought, well, this is really interesting because it creates a problem for the viewer. What does the viewer do when they come to an artwork and they can't understand exactly what the materials are? There's no description. They don't understand even what the size of the work is because its dimensions aren't described anywhere. They don't know, well, is this work, is it really this and this, or is this part of the work, or is this part of the work? Wrong button. I actually chose these forms because they reminded me very much of these light fixtures. And I thought, oh, well, that's funny to put a work too close to the light fixtures. Usually you would never do this. You're trying to get space, and make it look pristine. And I also liked how this, visually, when you came to this artist's work, this sort of framed the eye and it pointed down and helped you see hers better. So what happened when I did this was that a lot of people came to the exhibition and they got really pissed off. And some of the gestures I made actually were really close to the other artists' works. Though I had asked each of these artists permission, and the artists were fine with it, but the viewers didn't know that. So they were like, oh, that's so uncool what you did. And I was like really happy because I thought, oh, that's awesome. Like people are like mad when they're seeing my work versus bored. And I'd much rather have mad than bored. So I was like, okay, I'm on to something here. So this is another sort of shot of that exhibition that I curated. And I had built this wall which was framing this person's painting. Another painting was on it. And I was trying to make certain formal relationships between the works where, like, for example, here's this horse on a rider. This is a sculpture made by the artist Readymade. This is a painting by Brian Falstrom, where I was looking at how you make connections between things. And I want to make a point here, and I'll revisit this point later on in the talk. But one of the things I was looking at that amused me, and maybe I hadn't consciously constructed this, because Ruby said, oh, I'm going to show up with a crazy pink and purple sculpture, blah, blah. Okay, great. And then she showed up with this instead, like the day we're installing, and that's sort of the way artists work. You never know what you're getting. But it serendipitously created this nice connection here. And but beyond that, which was sort of a chance result, I was trying to make formal connections between the different pieces. So one of the things I liked about this, and I saw it later after I saw the imagery, was that not only was there a nice color relationship between these two, but you could actually imagine this is a sort of landscape, and this is sort of a rider on a horse going through the landscape. So I was thinking about, oh, what are the ways we make connections? Well, one of the ways we connect things that are disparate is through formal resonance, like in this case, the resonance of certain colors, but there's also symbolic resonances. Like we view this as a man on a horse, and we might view this as a landscape, and it's not a far stretch to think a man on a horse might be in a landscape. So these are sort of basic perceptual things I'm describing, but they do affect how we make sense of things. So I'll come back to that point in a bit. After I did that show, I proceeded to attempt to make works using other artists' works, but where I did so very explicitly, making something in relation to another artist's work, but not doing it surreptitiously where my name wasn't visible or it was like hidden or not accessible. I tried to make works where I borrow another artist's work and make something in response to theirs. So I put together another show with that in mind, and I invited several artists to participate, and then they all were flaky for different reasons, which were funny at the time, except for not so funny for me, because I was trying to make work in relation to their work. So I decided, oh, these artists are too hard to deal with, I don't know. What else could I use in the world that would have a sort of dynamic like that? And so I started looking, I was looking at neon signs then for a different reason, and I came upon this neon prop shop in Hollywood that rented neon signage out to TVs and films. And I was in there one day, and I saw this. This actually has like a blue element, and this one has a purple one. But I saw this, and I thought, oh, that's a really kooky sign. What is that? And they said, oh, that's from our 80s collection. The secretary in the office here designed it. It reminded her of the 80s. And we rent it out for shows that want to evoke the 80s. And I thought, that's hilarious. How did she decide that this is the 80s and that? Or could this have been over here a few more inches or whatever? But now she's decided that now that comes to represent the 80s whenever we watch Hollywood TV shows that need to quickly reference that. So I then produced this in response to that, and it's the same, it's just inverted, and this is purple and that's blue. In person, it's kind of hard to see it here. And I hung the two together, and the work is called The 80s. And the materials are rented neon sign and fabricated neon sign. So, and it's shown as one work. And it was in a painting exhibition at a gallery that I thought of as frequently showing expressionistic painting. So it was sort of a joke I was making with myself about how that gallery's I think kind of cheesy in what they show. So I thought I'd put something more cheesy there, and let's see what that would do. But anyway, so before I go here, let me go back here a sec. One of the things I'm looking at quite a lot is what happens when you locate the artist in a part of the work that's not where the artist would typically be located. What I mean by that is if you have an artwork and you're a viewer and you're coming to it and you're trying to make sense out of it, one of the questions you might ask is, oh, who made this? When was it made? What other kinds of works did they make? How does this work signify in relation to the other works of this artist? Whatever. And usually when you know an artist's body of work, it often changes the way you experience that individual piece. So I began thinking about, well, what happens if when people want to start asking those questions and make sense of my object in relation to their idea of who I am, what would happen if I were to start moving myself? And so the viewer could not locate the object in relation to me because I was constantly moving. And this is sort of an attempt at that, because I think normally you might come to a work and just from the outset assume the artist had made the whole thing until you learn more about it. But actually what happens is, here's me, sort of my gesture. I'm maybe Kathryn Andrews is framed by this part, and this part is something coming from the world. So Kathryn Andrews begins to become a frame that's framing something that precedes my interest. Here's another work that was sort of made with this thinking in maybe 2009, 2008 or 9, I can't remember. I was invited to be in a group show in Berlin, and some friends of mine organized it, and they said, will you put a sculpture in? And I said, well, that sounds really complicated. I'm in LA, and you guys don't have a budget for that. And I said, but, I like those kinds of circumstantial things because I think they can help you have a reason to make a work that you wouldn't normally make. So I said, why don't you guys just make a work and just put it in the show and just sign my name to the work? And they said, well, what would the work be? And I said, well, I have no idea. Just, have fun with it. So this is what they made, and they decided that this represented me. And like very literally, they were like, well, if we put her name on it, it really does represent her. And they put these little butterfly stickers on it. There's one there and there. And I just thought, oh, that's the sweetest thing in the world. Like, I would never make that, and that's fantastic. So I'm actually very conscious about being a woman artist, and I try to not make things that are overtly feminine because I feel like that would cause people to put me in the woman artist camp, which is a tricky camp to be in the art world because it's quite sexist in my opinion. So I really would never give myself permission to make this work, and I loved that this very feminine work had come out of this gesture that had nothing to do with me. This is another work I made maybe around the same time, and it came from a similar thinking. I began making a series of works that took the birthday as its subject matter, or as subject matter. I was thinking about, the person's birthday is this place where you can locate them from. They're born here, they're born in this place at this time, so we can begin to construct this narrative about who they are. So I began sort of looking at that subject matter as something that I'd work with, and you'll see more of that as I go forward. In any event, here, this was a diptych. This was some found wrapping paper I made. I think this piece is called Birthday. And this is a print that I made, and the way that I made it, it's a silk screen, it's unique, was that I went to this printmaker that I've worked with quite a lot. For years, he's been involved with all kinds of like LA artists that are heavily involved in printmaking. And as we were there, a lot of times I would go to his shop and he'd look at me and be like, what are we making? And I'd look at him and I'd be like, I don't know, got any ideas? And we would stand there and we just sort of look at each other. And I'd say, well, why don't we pull these colors out? I like these colors, I know that. And so we put them on the table. And I'd say, well, what are the things we could do with these colors? And he'd start to give me suggestions. And we'd look at all these prints in his flat files. And I'd say, well, what are things that people do with this medium? And so I made quite a few works with him and his assistant where I asked them to basically make the decisions as far as how the prints would be made. So this is one of the prints that was produced with their help. So they chose the colors and the way that the colors would be placed, and they laid them down and they pulled the print. And one of the things that I liked about that is that in the pairing of this with this, there was this sort of interesting relationship created. And when you see it in person, it's more obvious. Again, we're sort of having difficulty with the quality. So what happens is that there's like a little bit of play down here, and here there's something funny about how it's ripped. And you can't quite tell if this was made in response to this, or if this was made, that this was selected in response to that. So the order of how it happens gets mixed up. And there's something about that to me was very interesting, because it has a lot to do with like how you locate a thing. And one of the ways that you locate something is when you're looking at work, is you try to figure out the order in which it's made, or the process. And once you can sort of begin to understand that, then you can start drawing all these conclusions about it. So I might come back to that idea. Here's the work I made last year. It was made as part of an installation at Art Basel for a sort of solo exhibition I did in that fair's section for like emerging artists. And this piece is called John Hancock, and it's a big piece of vinyl. It's a vinyl sticker on a wall, and a chair. It's an aluminum chair with a bat that goes upright. And this is sort of in this birthday theme I was describing earlier. In order to make this work, and I'll show you a picture of the installation in a minute, again, it emerged out of this kind of decision-making process where I was heavily engaged in a conversation, in particular with my art dealer, and I was saying, I think this installation isn't working, it needs something more, we need to flesh it out, I have this idea to do this one thing. And he's like, I don't know if that's going to be good. One of my art dealers has a very strong opinion, generally, about almost everything. And for me, this is quite interesting, because I'm very open to influence. And I like that as a problem. Like, what happens? How does the artist make decisions? And what happens when the artist is passive and refuses to take a position? How can the artist create an identity that allows many subjectivities to come into play, and that keep that artist from being pinned down or easily identified? And so we were having a discussion about what this work would be, and it got to a place where we were in agreement that this would be a component and this would be a component. And part of why I'm even talking about this like this is I work quite differently than a lot of other artists, because a lot of the things I make are very produced, and as a result, they can be quite expensive. And as a result, there is a kind of influence that comes into play when you have that going on, because there's something at stake for many different people. So that becomes part of my process, but I try not to be singular in that in terms of affecting all the decisions. I try to open it up, and it drives people insane, but for me, it makes me laugh. So in any event, this piece came out of this art dealer going, I think you should put this bat upright on the chair. And I was like, well, why would you do that? I wouldn't want to do that. It's against my sculptural interest. In sculpture, I like when there's a problem of gravity and dependency, and the forms have to deal with this on their own. And for me, this feels incredibly theatrical. And he said, but it's much more phallic and aggressive, and I think that's interesting. And I said, well, that doesn't really interest me so much. And I said, but, since that's not something I would do, I'm going to do that, and let's see what that's about. So I made this piece, and people seem to really like that. So you can make sense of that how you like. But what's really interesting about it is that I decided to call it John Hancock, because that's, the pseudonym for signature in American slang. And since I, in particular, had not made a lot of the decisions about it. Here's another shot. Interestingly, the New York Times featured this work when they did coverage of what was going on in Miami that year. That piece is owned by Rosa and Carlos de la Cruz, and there they are standing in front of it. And then the New York Times says here, I've got a close-up of this, above the courtyard of Wynwood Walls, which is adding murals and graffiti from national and international artists this year for Art Basel, Miami Beach. Oh, sorry, we don't need to know that part. Okay, next. Carlos and Rosa de la Cruz, top right in front of John Hancock's work, a new addition to their collection for the fair. And I thought, well, that's hilarious. So again, I thought, well, what happens in this case? Like, do we bother to make this correction? Do we not? And as opposed to that example of the Art Basel website, if I call up Art Basel, they're going to make the correction, and then it's done. The link has been made. Here at the New York Times, if you call and make the correction, it's additive, it's layered. They will make a correction, it will get printed later, but this thing won't be erased. Maybe on their website it will, but there's a historic record of these differences. So I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. We can make the correction, but we still have the original. So it's like we get it all the different ways. So I called and I said, guys, can you please make this correction? And so here they did, and I'll show you the close-up of that. A picture caption on Wednesday with an article about the Art Basel Miami Beach Art Fair misidentified the creator of a work shown behind the collectors Carlos and Rosa de la Cruz. She is Kathryn Anderson, not John Hancock. John Hancock is the title of the work. Great. Thanks, guys. Cool. You're really doing your jobs there. So I was like, well, what do we do with that? So I was like, well, we've got to just keep going, you know? So then again, a picture caption on November 30th, yada, yada, yada. And because of an editing error, a correction in this space on December 3rd misstated her surname. John Hancock is the title of the work, not the name of its creator. It was made by Kathryn Andrews, not Anderson. Finally, thank you. I am so glad that we have this worked out. So in any event, you can see here, this was the installation I was describing that this work was made from. The sticker was over here behind the wall. One of the things I was looking at also is what happens when you make certain kinds of forms and works and you repeat those forms elsewhere. How can that be a way of emptying out meaning? You begin to see, these were a series of sort of like baby crib-like forms that were sort of expanding and becoming more almost like prisons. And so I was looking at when you take this form and you put it here, what does that do to the reading of the chair? How do we begin to think about a chair as a kind of prison or the different associations that it suggests? I won't go too much further into that. Here's another work that I made. And I'm sorry, this is not the best reproduction, but it was. This is from Dave Kordansky's website. That's one of the gallerists I work with. And it was made in 2010, Kathryn Andrews rod, that's what it was called, kind of a dumb title. Chrome steel, rented props, blah, blah, blah. The way this work was made was I produced this steel pole, I had it chrome plated, and I rented these props to support it. And my idea about that was I was thinking about how can we take the artwork and the way that we come to it and experience it as a kind of unified event, and how could I create another kind of experience of that so that you would come to it and maybe experience it in parts or start to imagine that one part of it is important and maybe not another part. And so in this case, I was talking before about how could my gestures be sort of the frame for found objects or other things in the world that precede me. In this case, that component might be this. And I have, again, I'll just put this idea out there now, and we'll begin to see this more in the works. I've begun to repeatedly use the same material, which is sort of the shiny silver, chrome or stainless steel or polished aluminum thing to begin to create an identity for Kathryn Andrews. If I use this material again and again and again and again, how will people create an association around me? And what happens when that association becomes like very tight, like Kathryn Andrews with this type of material? And I've purposefully done this. When I started making works, I was resisting that. People would come to works and they'd be like, oh, you're that artist that does this thing. And I'd be like, oh no, that's the death of the artist. Once they can identify you as doing this thing, they're done with you because they figured out your game. And so I was trying to make all different kinds of works, but people are always trying to sort of place the artist in a categorical camp so they can like understand it and then move on to consuming the next thing. And so instead of resisting that, I decided one day, like, why don't I just go through that? So I would try and become hyper-identified with this thing and then see what kind of space could be created once that identification was in place. So that's something I've been working with for quite a while, and I'll begin to talk about that more. But I like this idea that Kathryn Andrews could maybe be represented by this, and then these are maybe these temporary things that, because they're rented objects, you know they're there on loan, they have a short life, and that implies that they would return to their point of origin later. I have made several works with rented props, quite a few now, and it took me a while to understand, for me, what my relationship was to that and the way that that would signify. This is the same work, and it's also on Dave's website. I don't think he realizes these two versions are there. Please don't tell him. And it's called Pushing Daisies, 2007, which is a different title, 2010, blah, blah, blah. This is lifted from one of the TV shows where these appeared. This was rented from a Hollywood prop shop, and I took that title from there. What happened in this work, and again, this is sort of one of the ways that I work. I often make gestures, but they're collaborative. And I would say this work became a sort of collaboration with the collectors that purchased it. I was in the midst of a very intense debate about, with the rented objects, would the relic of what had come into contact with the rented object, and in this case it would be that, would that just go on and have a life of its own, and now the rented component, would that go back to its place of origin? Or would the rented things be consumed, and now basically the sense of the work, it would be transformed? I wasn't sure what to do about that, and it was part of, the decision had something to do with the market for me. That's how I saw it in terms of what people would consume. Why would people want to buy something when they just get this and they don't get this, and the person they're buying it from, they don't know? I don't know, that's a good question. Either they're like so convinced it's such a brilliant idea that they just want to go for it, or I'm not really sure about that. So in the beginning, I didn't know how to go with this. And so I was sort of looking to my dealers to see what strategies they would adopt, because they were on the front lines dealing with people that would sort of either accept this idea or not. And they came up with different strategies. And at this point, I've tried them all, and I can see what works and doesn't work. But some things work in the place of the market, and then other things work, from my perspective, more in the interest of the object. And sometimes those are in alignment, and sometimes they're not. And it depends on the specific object. In this case, the people that ended up purchasing this said, oh, we love that work. We think it's so interesting, but we really want to buy these rented objects too. And at that time, I wasn't decided about it. And I thought, well, if that goes with it, maybe that's interesting. And the whole thing becomes a relic of this sort of active thing that it was. And now it's a dead thing. So by its being consumed in its entirety, it becomes this sort of corpse of itself. So I sold it, but I decided then that its original title did not make sense, because with these rented and this not rented, there was a great sort of division articulated there, and so the title Rod really pointed to that. Now that the whole thing was being consumed, I felt that that wasn't the case, so I changed the title. Later, I decided I didn't think that that decision was so interesting, and so I don't do that anymore in that way. But what I did like is that now this work is out there in the world, and there's different representations for it, and it's been reproduced under different titles in different magazines as well. This is, and there you can just see the back of it. But I'm really going to tell you now about this piece. This is a work I made a little bit later using a painting of John Baldessari. So you can see here I was invited to make an exhibition and a collection that owned this particular painting. This painting is, well, that's the image of it reversed from Baldessari's Goya series, and it's called The Same Elsewhere. And so my piece was to make a mirror that was the exact same size as the Baldessari painting and to hang it across the room from it. And in particular, I liked that I chose that painting because of its text. Obviously, that's creating a relationship with its reflection elsewhere. But this other very interesting thing happened, which was this image was here, and this ladder sort of getting cut off by the image. And if you're a viewer and you come to view this work, your body stands in front of the mirror and your legs get cut off in the same way that the ladder gets chopped off. And I didn't in advance know that that would happen. It was sort of the serendipitous thing. Some of the other things about this work that I liked a lot was that the title is called Baldassare, and usually the title information's here, so you see it says Baldassare. And then if you want to go in and really experience it, you stand here. But as you stand here, you can't see the Baldassare painting. You're blocking it. So you see this thing that's suggesting something beyond itself, but then you see your own reflection. So your own desire to sort of consume the experience of this work and the way that it points outside ends up pointing back to yourself, to the viewer. This is another one of those funny games for me where the representation of this work sort of always ends up having objects in it. Whether, in this case, it was a sculpture in the room that was hard to move, but it could be just the photographer's tripod. The way you want to shoot it, it's quite difficult to get it without the tripod there. So I had this retouched. And this work exists in the world, reproduced, sometimes like this, which in my mind is not the work. What the hell does that have to do with it? Or it exists like this. And that was another one of those funny moments where I, as the artist, was taking the agency to say, this is the work, you know, and this becomes this negotiation between all the powers that be. But in any event, it sort of amused me that people seem to think that was fine as a representation of the work. This is a work I made more recently, this past year, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that. This is a print that I purchased by the artist Alan Ruppersberg, who works in California. He's in his 60s. He's worked with pop imagery and like printed reproductions for a long time. This was his attempt. In the 80s, he made a lot of works using obituaries from newspapers. And this work was sort of his attempt to make a spoof on a movie poster. And maybe the film would be called Scream from Life. He's sort of the director in this idea. And these are clippings of different sort of gruesome killings that happened around this time. And he went in to put in some little handwritten sayings, I love you too. And I saw this print and I thought, oh, that's a really fascinating object. The way that these are made, he would take the newspaper clippings and hand trace them, and then he would photograph them, and then he would silk screen them. So there's this process of like many kinds of removal happening. There's this primary information that's like incredibly gruesome about this event that's transpired, but it's sort of been anesthetized by its reproduction in the newspaper. Then he recharges it by redrawing it. Then he re-anesthetizes it by photographing it. It's so many layers, and that's one of the things Ruppersberg's interested in. And then he creates a sort of opposition by bringing back the presence of handwriting, but then it's silk screened, so it's yet again removed. So he's very involved in those games. Well, I like those games too, and so I thought, that's cool. I'm going to buy this work, and I'm going to make a frame for it. And so I was invited to be in this exhibition that was about artists working with other artists' works, making collaborations, but in a really broad sense of that term. And I don't really think of this as a collaboration because I didn't ask Al Ruppersberg's permission. Maybe it's a collaboration between me and the art market because the art market, by buying artists' works, now takes over that ownership and can do with them what they like. In essence, taking the right to destroy this work if they like. I worked with the same silkscreen maker that Ruppersberg had worked with 30 years prior and produced these two side panels. And I researched lots of gruesome killings from around the same time. Not speaking with Al, I didn't know where he had sourced his material, so I had to source my own through other methods. I hired someone to retrace these newspaper clippings to look at like Al Ruppersberg's hand, and then we copied Al's handwriting and using the same processes attempted to make a seamless sort of frame. And this piece is called Massacre Expansion. It's called Massacre Expansion. So I was looking at, for me, I was like, well, why did Al choose these particular killings? Like, why these versus any other? That's a subjective choice. That, in the end, becomes about Al Ruppersberg, in my mind. So I was like, well, if this work is about this kind of gruesome this kind of culture of that. Like, he could have just as easily chosen this or that or whatever. So I was like, let's just expand that and begin to look at what the subjective influences are in Al Ruppersberg making this work. So this piece is called Massacre Expansion, with the idea of sort of exploring that. And if you read it, when I first read it, I was sort of mortified, and then I ended up reading it like a million times, and now I find them all hilarious, which is quite disturbing. But this one's maybe one of the best. Artist died handcuffed to tree. This artist decides to commit suicide. He chains himself to a tree. He changes his mind, but he's tossed the keys away, and he can't get to the keys, and he scrambles to get it, but he dies. These are real. These are stories of things that happened in the world. Victim of cannibal, agreed to be eaten. That's a really interesting one. But anyway. So in the same, when I conclude, I want to take this back to a question about sculpture, because ultimately the questions, and we're in the Nasher Museum, which is looking at sculpture, ultimately the questions I'm asking have very much to do with what happens when you're in a situation where the presence of representation is so intense that it influences the way that you perceive other aspects of the object. And in particular, maybe its formal qualities, its material nature, things like that. So sort of what I'm asking, if you think about it in that regard, is a question about really sort of the dichotomy or the difference between pop and minimalism. Pop art sort of putting images at its pinnacle, minimalism putting an experience of the materials of things at its core. So I'll keep developing that thought as we go. This work was part of that same exhibition where it was at the ICA in Philadelphia, where artists were asked to make work collaboratively, but in an expanded definition of that term. And so I decided to make a work for that exhibition. It was called Serial Killer, and it consisted of this fence, and this fence was on wheels. There were many works throughout the exhibition. The fence would move throughout the exhibition over its 5 months of being on view. And the way the fence would move is that a performer would come and perform next to the fence for 2 hours. The performer was always a human statue. It would pose in a still position, and then it would depart. The next performer would come in, move the fence to a new position, perform for 2 hours, and then depart, and so on and so forth. The instruction given to the performer was to wheel the fence so that it was blocking another artist's work. So the artwork, in essence, sort of went on, it had an attack mission. And its mission was to complicate sort of the way that we understand artworks in relation to context. And it very heavy-handedly created aggressive context for these works, sort of calling their purity or the way that we perceive them outside of their relationship to everything else, calling that into question. So here, I'll quickly go through these. These are some images of the different performers. And I selected performers and coupled them with works frequently based on their appearance. This artist had maybe borrowed works from 20 different artists and made this installation using all these artists' works with their permission. In my case, I just wheeled mine next to his without his permission, but he was happy about that. But not everyone was always happy about it. The curators said to me, "Oh, Kathryn, what should we do?" Oh, this guy's a tree, actually. It's hard to see, but the curators were like, "Should we ask everyone's permission? What are we supposed to do in this case?" And I said, "I don't know. You agreed to this work, and we never talked about it, and now we're down the road. What do you think you should do?" And they said, "Well, we think it might be good to ask, but I don't know." And I said, "Well, you'll figure that out. That's your business." And I said, in the worst case, though, if we put it next to an artist's work and they don't like it, they can say they don't like it, and then we can move it again. And interestingly, as the exhibition went on, they got more lazy about it, and I think they stopped asking people. But I think they did sort of pre-warn all the other artists. That was The Thinker, and this is next to some philosophical texts by some other artist group. So anyway, so I figured we could go from this guy into Brancusi. This is the Kiss column from 1935. And then I wanted to show you this work, which is Adam and Eve from 1921. And what I wanted to talk about here is what happens formally in Brancusi's work and sort of how some of the things he's doing relate to some of the things I'm doing. And this goes back to the bat and the chair comment I was making earlier, which is that Brancusi is very interested in stacking, and he's interested in the problems of gravity and how dependencies can be created simply by putting one form onto another form, and the way continuities get created through this simple stacking gesture. That's something that interests me a lot. One of the ways we make connections by things is by looking at literally like how they physically rest upon each other, or are they separate? So that's a sort of formal device that I use when making works a lot. This is a work I made in 2010 called Ashton. And it's a coat hanger rack. I cast that. It's made out of stainless steel. And a coat hanger, I also cast that. And on it sits a ring that Ashton Kutcher wore in the movie The Killers. And the material, this piece is just called Ashton. The materials are stainless steel and certified film prop. I actually don't know what that is made out of. It looks like stainless steel, but I doubt it. It's probably something cheaper. What interested me about this work was to take something that was materially all sort of unified, and gravitationally you have this ring that's sort of dependent upon this object, and it hooks into that, so it just rests there. But then that hooks onto that, and then that goes to this. So it's very much sort of like the same kind of idea of Brancusi putting one thing on top of another, and each is dependent upon another. But one of the things that works a little bit differently here is that you have here a lot of work that has something to do with the hand of the artist, in my mind. You know, it's been produced. If you look at it carefully, you can sort of tell that it's cast. So in my mind, I was thinking a lot about like how this thing has to do with the hand of the artist. In this case, Kathryn Andrews, and could I marry Ashton Kutcher by putting his ring on my gesture? And this was his wedding band also from that movie that I mentioned that he was in. But yet at the same time, I do think this work has a kind of dichotomy, because you have this object which has a very erratic presence in terms of like aura, like its significance or its sort of value, because this piece of material has come into contact with this individual who's very popularly valued within the culture. And there's some kind of question being asked about, well, what is the value of this thing that's the tiniest thing, that's maybe a very cheap material and has been traded in these economies, these filmic economies, and what does that have to do with the art object and all of the effort put into this, and now the cost of that object and how that functions as a signifier that suggests its value culturally. This is another work I made maybe a year later. Jeffrey Deitch called me up and said, oh, I saw you did that piece with Baldessari. I got a show of George Herms coming. I thought you might do something like that for us. And I thought, okay, that's weird. I don't know George Herms, and now I'm that artist that does that thing with other artists, but that's cool. So he's like, why don't you call up George Herms and you guys work it out? And I just thought, oh, this is bizarre. And I was like, well, what can I do to George Herms? And I thought, well, maybe he and I could get married. And then I sort of checked into his dating history and thought, well, no, that's too complicated. So, but we could show the certificate of our marriage, and maybe we could divorce each other a few days later. Instead, George had this idea that he would lend to me a bunch of documents from his archive, collage material that he had. And he's like, I'll just drop it over to your studio, Kathryn. I thought, well, that's, he said, but I've got a ton of these too, you know, if you don't like them. And I said, well, why don't I just come over to your place and just go through all your stuff? And he said, okay, come on by. So I did, and while I was there, I came across boxes and boxes of envelopes. Well, the Getty Museum had gone to George Herms, and if you don't know who he is, he's an artist, like almost in his 70s. He lives in Los Angeles. He's very involved with the Beat generation, Beat poetry movement, blah, blah, blah. basically the mid-20th century in California. And so he's sort of an important person historically because he's a link between many of the different poets that are working at that time and a connector between poetry and art. The Getty Museum went to his archive or asked him, could they basically take many of his correspondences for preservation. He agreed. They went through everything. They got in there some weeks before I did. And they left the envelopes, however, from these correspondences. They only took the contents. And I thought, well, that's so bizarre because the envelopes give all the information about who it's from, who it's to, the date it was sent back and forth. And that's another one of those funny places where the institution decides how something's going to be represented, which may or may not correspond with other representations that are commonly understood. So as I was going through his artifacts, I thought, well, maybe I can make her work with this. And I was looking at all of these envelopes, and I realized George had moved many times over the years. So here's one from the 70s. He lived on South Figueroa. One in the 80s. He had this P.O. box in Orange, California. One in the 90s. He's on East 1st Street. And so I asked him if I could borrow these documents, and he said yes. And we never agreed when I would return them. I still have them on loan. So I made this work with them, and I rented this bench from a prop house. And I like this idea that you're coming to a work by Kathryn Andrews, but you're seeing these documents by George Herms. So already there's a question about, well, what's the relationship of Kathryn Andrews to George Herms? But then George is like moving through space, essentially. This object is moving through space as well because it's only rented for the duration of the exhibition. And then symbolically, there's some kind of suggestion of things moving through space, these being envelopes, which is what they do, and these being chairs where you might sit. But there's this option of where you'd like to sit. You could sit here, 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 which becomes sort of mimetic of what George is doing in space here. Funny part about this work is that I returned this bench to the prop house. Someone contacted me to purchase it. I thought, okay, well, then I have to go to the prop house and get a very long-term borrow agreement. So I negotiated this with the prop house. Cool, all set. The person was taking a long time to pay, like months and months and months. And so I was like, well, are they really interested in this work, or did they just want to hold it, or what happened? And so finally, they're like, okay, the deal is done. We're ready to move forward. I was like, cool, okay, I'm going to go back to the prop house now, and we'll get this object for you. Done, goodbye. George Herms, I love you. You exist. You're in the world now in this work. And I went back to the prop house, and they said, oh, we've sold that. We didn't hear from you for a while, and we've liquidated a lot of our goods. So that's gone now. So this work does not exist anymore. It only existed temporarily. So that object's off somewhere else. And I love that. I think that's just the perfect end for this piece.
Woo!
That sort of takes us to... this is a work I made in... this summer in Switzerland, and I'll sort of go through this a little bit quickly. But as you can see, the theme that's emerging here is what happens when what we take for granted as the static object in space, what happens when its components get activated or begin to shift or take on different kinds of roles in terms of the way that they can be used. Here I made a performance this summer in Basel, Switzerland, as part of the art fair. They commissioned me to make a performance event for the opening night of this section of the fair. I was given a particular site for it. So I decided to construct a series of walls along this riverbank, which the site was here. And you could enter these structures from this end and from this end, but you couldn't go out the sides because the buildings were here or here because you'd be in the river. So you could only go back and forth this way. The curator had asked me if I would work with vaudevillian type entertainment for the event. And he asked me that because I'd done another performance earlier in the year where I'd done something along those lines. So I decided, okay, well, the idea of vaudeville is sort of interesting because it's the type of spectacle that maybe would be fun to see at an art fair. So how could I work with that but try to complicate that? And so I decided to use this wordplay vaudeville in French, it's very close to voix de ville, voice of the city. And there's a sort of historic relationship to those terms, maybe etymologically. So I decided to call this piece vaudeville, and to use imagery that was exploring, let's see, I'll just go through these sort of quickly so you can see some of what happened to get to some of the imagery. Here you can see there's an image of Florence with the viewfinder in front of it. So what I was trying to do, and here you can't really see this, but here's a picture of the Alps with a drunk man in front who's sort of clinging onto his beer glass. I was trying to take these sort of idyllic landscapes that were similar to the landscape behind these sets and look at our interest in consuming them and what happens in this kind of situation when we want to go and have this particular experience in relation to an art fair. We don't know what it is, but we know we're going there to consume something that's to be consumed, something enjoyable. So I took the site itself and attempted to double it and to try and make a kind of criticism of our coming to that, expecting something from that. And then I overlaid that using this vaudeville relationship to the viewer's relationship to the performers. They were coming to these performers, participating in this spectacle, and the viewers were expecting to get something from them. So their sort of consumption of the performative gesture was very similar to the consumption of the touristic landscape. So the acts, what happened was that there were many acts throughout these structures throughout the night. There were 8 of them. Performers from all over Europe came in, and they were highly specialized in what they did. I didn't choreograph their acts. They did the acts that they normally do, though I did choreograph the event and the music and how it all played out in terms of an order. And I constructed it so that, let's go back real fast. One performance would say begin here, all the viewers would flood into the structures to see this, then another performance would begin here. The viewers would become trapped between the different performances going on. This one went in, another one would start here. There was a sort of relief, the viewers could move around, but then another one would start again right here. So the viewers were constantly being shuffled around in this dance, where really they became the ones sort of like hemmed in by what was going on. And there was a sort of inversion where typically the viewers would consume what's in front of them. What's in front of them would be what would be consumed, maybe the subject of the work. There was the switch where the viewers were actually being sort of consumed by what was going on around them. So it was like taking the frame and making the frame the center of the work and taking the center of the work and pushing it outside. This is another piece I made a couple years ago, and so I'm really jumping around a lot chronologically, but I'm trying to draw out a set of ideas, so I hope that this is making some sense to you, where I tried to do something quite similar. And I won't go too in depth here because I feel like we're running long now, but this was an exhibition where there were a lot of artists involved, and this piece, again, emerged in that very conversational way that I work with people. Where, in fact, many of its physical properties were sort of dictated, permitted, encouraged, invited by the other people who were involved, everything from curators to gallerists to other artists around, where I had this idea to make a work that would really radically affect how people could move through the space and see other artists' works. And I was like, but I want to be respectful and da-da-da. And all the other artists were like, no, go bigger, go more aggressive, go this, go that. And I was like, okay. So that's kind of funny. But then later, as the artists who made it, people were very excited about this. There was a lot of press, but one critic was very negative about that. And I thought, oh, that's interesting because the person's work that I came in conflict with had actually invited me and asked me to do that. But again, that's one of those places where the representation of what happens gets confused with what happened, and that's quite common. These were 2 walls. These images were replicas of some graffiti down the street. I just basically appropriated them and copied them. And then what happened in viewing this, people came to this work to look at these sort of faces painted in the center of this object, but these faces were sort of empty and expressionless, and the viewers themselves ended up sort of becoming the subject of the work. They were looking at these things that were sort of contained by this fence or framed in, but in the end, the viewers themselves were framed by the piece and restricted. They couldn't move through the space freely. So the viewers ended up being all around the perimeter, the outside, sort of gawking to see this thing on the inside, but then realizing that they themselves were the ones sort of being consumed by the piece. This is a more traditional, this is a painting by Hans Hofmann, but I pulled these because I wanted to look at a more traditional sculpture I made recently, and I wanted to, it has a lot of sort of Hans Hofmann-esque painterly qualities, and I wanted to look at or just point to when you see an artwork, particularly a painting, well, particularly this painting, there's a frame around it, and it's very common in the world that you'll come to works and they're framed by the room they're in, the other artworks they're with, whatever, maybe very literally a frame if it's a painting. And for me, that's so bizarre because as the artist, you almost never have control over this, yet your name is attached to that object as if you like that way that your work is being presented or being perceived. So this is a Hans Hofmann painting that's been framed. This is a work that I made last year. It's called Gift Cart, and it's a stainless steel cart with rented presents from a prop shop. Here's another Hans Hofmann painting in a frame. I was looking at this quite literally as a frame, almost for like a painting. Another one. And here you can see they're sort of used. That's from going off on set to be in different films. One of the things that was nice about this work that I hadn't intended was that I thought it might happen, but I wasn't quite sure how. The viewer would come and stand next to this cart and be reflected here. And then there were these presents. So it was almost like their reflection was being framed by the work and perhaps contained within the presence, if you can go along those lines of thinking. This is another work I made that's sort of similar to that. That was a wall sculpture where balloons, it has a birth date. So this one was January 23rd, and I put these balloons on it on that day. They deflate over time, and the owner of the work receives a set of instructions that the owner can activate this work in a particular way. And the work sort of arrives with this material problem inherent to it, which is that you have this gate, which is a very permanent structure, with this other material that's deteriorating. And so it creates this problem from the outset. The instructions the owner receives are, the owner may add new balloons, and this is on its birth date in consecutive years. The owner may replace the original balloons. New balloons may or may not resemble the originals. The owner may not acknowledge the work the owner may acknowledge the work differently in different years. The owner may allow a third party to acknowledge the work. Acknowledgement may take a form not mentioned here. Essentially, the collector is given the role of the artist. The collector is allowed to be the agent in the work. And now the collector becomes Kathryn Andrews. In a very literal way, the collector will make whatever interventions to this piece, and this piece will be exhibited under my name. And there are 4 of these in the world, sort of one for each season, if you will. And they each have, except for the first one, they have the dates of the owner's birth dates. I think I'll just skip past this because we're... this work is a work called Into Vaudeville, and it's a photograph that sits on a mirrored armoire, and this is a piece of stainless steel that has a very strange reflective quality. And for me, it's quite a funny piece. I like it. It's a very sort of casual, almost lazy piece in a way. You come to it and you see yourself reflected here fully, the top of your body here, the bottom of your body here, but the way that you're reflected is different because stainless steel creates this very strange, almost like funny mirror type reflection, and this is a normal reflection here. And then when you come to the photo, you see almost a double of the human body, except for it's in this very gaudy garb. And that's actually an image of Mae West from a film in the 1930s. And I liked that in seeing your reflection, it's almost like you're being dressed by the dresser. And then you see this other person in a dress. And so there's a funny doubling that's going on there. This is another work I made called Charlie's Angel. This is a helmet that Cameron Diaz wore in one of the Charlie's Angel films. And this is just sort of a formal gesture that materially, this material is being extended into the form of the sculpture, but here there's sort of the absence of Cameron Diaz, and then maybe that absence is suggested also by this maybe being a kind of very industrialized body that's sort of been rid of the human. And here there's just the absence of the human presence in a way. So I think all of these works are sort of getting to this question about how we locate the subject when we're experiencing an artwork, and what happens when you start to dislocate the ways by which that's traditionally located. This is a work I made earlier in the year called Ascension Island, and it was with a found statue of Jesus in an aluminum mirror in an oval shape. And I like this piece a lot, actually, because I think it's a strange piece. I think some people don't know how to deal with it. But I like it a lot because I think it's very unclear what my relationship is to the iconography of Jesus in it. And if Kathryn Andrews, as a maker, has somehow come or is coming to be identified with this material, it's almost like here's the presence of Jesus, here's the presence of Kathryn Andrews, but what that relationship is not qualified. And I think there's something curious about that. This is another work I made around the same time. I'm almost done. So there are a couple. These works a little bit different. There's this sculpture and one last one, and I'll stop. Some works I've made are sort of taking that question of frame and framed, but exploring it in spaces that are already from the outset more unified. So here, if everything here is sort of black, this is in one kind of space, and then this is coming off the wall and being separated from it. I was also looking at this as a very phallic form and thinking about how that might read in relation to that, but almost as if you've taken this sort of sexual iconography and translated it into some kind of kitschy cultural realm. And these are bowling balls with some aluminum inserts. And this is a piece I made recently called Full Set, which is a sculpture of a weight bench, but these forms can't be removed from their frame. They're built in. That's it. I don't know if anyone has any questions or.
I think I know the answer. I think I know how you'll answer. You had two images. One was Rob, the other one you changed the name of it. There were four jockeys, I guess, that you had rented, and they had a bar. It was interesting to me that further on that, I guess it was Ed Hearn, where you went back to purchase or long-term loan, whatever, those seats, and they were gone, then that was a problem. Well, that's interesting. So let's say you, the artist, are being asked by your dealer a question by prospective buyer. Well, what do you mean you're going to take those jockeys away? How am I going to hold up that rod or whatever? Is your thought too that's just an interesting problem, or do you find it more interesting or less interesting that the rod would have to be placed on the floor in a collector's home, or what is your thinking behind that?
Personally, I liked really any of the ways, because I think they all have value and they're all about the ways that we construct context for objects, and those contexts influence the value of the thing that it's relating to. So that rod, depending on how you answer that, will have a different value each time. That's great in a theoretical realm. In a practical realm, that doesn't play out so easily because you have to deal with all these systems by which these objects get traded. And further, what I realized was that for the viewer, it's really excellent if the object that's creating the context can come along, because then subsequent viewers who maybe didn't see it in its first iteration have access to this game. Otherwise, they're looking at a rod and then you have to tell them a story about it, which is okay. Some artists work like that and you can work like that, but then you need a lot of ancillary documentation. Someone has to stand next to it and do the dance. And that's fine, but sometimes that can really work, and then sometimes it's just too much work and no one's going to deal with it. So I found that in my case, people weren't doing the adequate work to suggest what the original context had been, so that maybe it was my job as the artist to bring the context along with it, but to bring it under a rubric of temporality, which in this case was you as the buyer can possess this object, but through a rented contract of 99 years, which suggests temporality, if that makes sense. Does that, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Were you monitoring our reaction to the right side while you were talking about that?
Not too closely, but I was happy you were having a reaction. I gave a talk in February to about 200 people, and I realized that when I speak to a small crowd, I get certain responses, but when I speak to a big crowd, the dynamics are different. And maybe I was just giving a really boring talk that day, it happens, but I found that the audience was not responding to the parts that I think of as funny, or where I was waiting for a laugh, like no one was laughing. And so I started freaking out and second-guessing myself. And so I was speaking, and then the audience wouldn't respond, and then I would monitor that. And then I would think about what I was saying. Well, was it funny or was it not funny? How was it failing? And then I was trying to continue the talk forward. So I was processing these 4 or 5 things while I was giving the talk, and I ended up slowing down. And we were all sort of like trapped in this like torturous talk. So then I thought, oh God, well, the solution there is I could just preemptively provide the response, so I could just generate the laughs. So whenever the laughs aren't coming as I need, I can just like bring the laughs out. So you guys are sort of my guinea pigs for that, so I hope that worked out. But oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, I did a lot. So, anyone else in the back?
What has surprised me is that as an installation artist, you don't expect your work to be immortal. So, when somebody does a thinker, or you've done a statue and artwork that are created, I'm sure in their mind the sense of the longevity of that piece of art. You seem to be so much more willing to accept the mortality of your piece, and also to have a more dynamic engagement with the viewer and with fellow artists, but you're not really interested in immortalizing.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. And maybe it goes back to this question about sculpture and photography that I had wanted to end with, because I started in photography actually and came to making sculpture through making photography. And one of the things that has interested me more and more over time is the degree to which we confuse our image of things, our representation of things with our experience of those things, and the degree to which we substitute those quite easily. And I am always looking for places to sort of create a presentness in the work. And for me, I think all of the mediums do that, sculpture, photography, painting, and they all engage representation as well in different ways. But I think in the medium of photography, it's much easier to confuse the image of the thing with the photograph. Whereas in sculpture, I think it's trickier. You can see a representation of something, but you're generally more aware of the material of what you're looking at. So I would probably argue that sculpture has more of a presentness about it. But one of the things that's happened, I think, is that because we've seen so many images in the age of the internet, they've become ubiquitous in the culture, that we've stopped looking at sculpture in the same way that maybe we would have prior, because it doesn't quite perform at the same rate that images perform, and I think our perception has changed. So I do look for ways to create action within sculpture, or to make sculpture an active space so we can remind ourselves of the presentness of materiality in all mediums, really, if that makes sense. But yeah. Great. Maybe we're done. Thank you very much.